Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the MP Sanders podcast, and we're going to start a whole new series today, which is just the Bible series. I thought it'd be interesting as an adult to read through the Bible page by page and give my opinion on what these stories are saying. But it should be made pretty clear that it's pretty much impossible to interpret any sort of literature in a vacuum. Right, I grew up in Lutheran and Catholic schools. I'm an atheist now. I listen to a lot of atheist content. I also listen to Christian content. Well, if you can consider Jordan Peterson a Christian, I'm sure that would count. But I listen to creationist content just to see what they're saying. I listen to a wide range of stuff, but it's obvious that people like Alex O'Connor are probably going to be where my general interpretation heads toward. And that's just how humans interpret anything, right? Like your life experiences, your opinions, your memories, the content you watch, all of those things are going to play a major role in how you interpret this, or interpret any literature. So, what I'm saying is basically it's not that these ideas aren't original necessarily, but they're not formed in a vacuum, right? They're built on top of other people's opinions, and that would include people like Alex O'Connor and Jordan Peterson. And I wanted to read this as an adult, like I said, but I think the best way to learn about something and to really interpret something is to write about it and talk about it, which is really the motivation behind this. Every time I do this podcast, I don't expect thousands of views and making a lot of money. A lot of it is for me as well, because I like to talk about things that I'm trying to learn about so I can really hear myself, like rewatch the video and hear what I'm saying and see if it registers as well as it feels as I'm talking about it, right? So it's trying to learn is really the goal of this entire podcast, and hopefully there's a few people that learn alongside with me based off the things I say. So the ideas and interpretations I give in this video or throughout the rest of the series are not necessarily my own. They're conglomerations of my experiences and other things that I've heard and things I've learned throughout my life going through Lutheran and Catholic schools. And every interpretation of literature is going to be sort of a communal effort with the people you're around, right? Like, one of the best ways to tell if an interpretation of literature is good is if multiple people came to it independently, right? Like, if you have 7 people that all say, oh, this story seems to be saying this, and you have a pretty good indication that that's what it's saying. But if you just get one response that says this, it's like maybe you're reading into this incorrectly or the wrong way. So that sort of communal response to interpreting literature is just how it's done, and it's impossible to have your own interpretation in a sense. And as the title says, and anyone who's watched past episodes of this podcast knows that I am an atheist. But before I really get into this, I want to talk a little bit about the Bible and really one specific thing that I feel like a lot of atheists get wrong, and it's that the Bible is not one book, it's a library of books, which is, most people are aware of that, but the thing that is often missed when talking about that is that since it's a library, there are multiple genres of books in there. So one thing you'll commonly hear atheists say is, oh, well, how do you get to take this part of the Bible literally and this part metaphorically and then just outright ignore this part? That's a fair argument in some ways, especially when you get into more of like the way the religion wants to treat gay people, for example, in society. And, there's a conversation to be had there, no doubt. But the counter-argument is, well, these are different genres of books, right? Like Psalms they're just full of poems and songs, basically. And I know the Gospel of Thomas is not a canonical text, but it's a good example of what I'm talking about because it's just a list of sayings that Jesus said, right? And the book of Genesis is kind of fantastical fiction, as is the book of Revelations. But when you look at the Gospel of John, for example, it's pretty clear that that was meant to serve as some sort of historical documentation, as well as being a very deep philosophical document. The author of the Gospel of John is probably the best theologian in the Bible. It is brilliant, that entire gospel. And you should not compare the literal truth factor or potential of the Gospel of John to something like the book of Revelations, because they're clearly meant to serve different purposes in terms of the literary technique. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first story we're going to start with is the story of Adam and Eve. I skip over the first few chapters of Genesis just because I don't have much to say about the creation story. I'm not sure what to make of that story, and that, I'm sure if I spent a lot of time in sort of theologic philosophy, I could come up with something, or I'm sure religious philosophers and Christian philosophers have a lot to say about that story like they do everything else, and I don't expect it to have any less philosophical and metaphorical value than the two stories we're going to analyze here today. It's just that I am not really been able to figure out what that story means, and since that is the case, I don't just want to ramble about something I don't know anything about, and I want to give my opinion on Adam and Eve. But one interesting thing about the creation story is that it was actually written after Adam and Eve the story of Adam and Eve. It was written long after, like potentially a couple centuries after. So it's interesting because the book of Genesis is clearly a composite story. Like it's a bunch of different stories all put into one that were written at different times and written by different people. So whoever decided to finally put this composite together put the creation story first, even though it was written long after. It could have been added in for the purpose of just filling gaps. I don't know, but that is an interesting little tidbit to me. So I think most people know how this story goes. Adam was created first from the dirt of the earth, and then Eve was taken from his rib while he was sleeping. And from what I understand, most Christian philosophers claim that she was taken from his rib for a specific reason. She wasn't taken from his head, which is like the top of the body, the most powerful part of the body, or his foot, which is at the bottom on the ground, but the center, meaning that there is equilibrium and equality between these two people. And at first, before the first sin is committed, which we will cover later on, there was no claim of Eve being subject to Adam. Again, that does change after they eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, but according to most Christian philosophers, even the choice of where Eve was taken from has rather significant philosophical value. And if this is true, like a good interpretation of the story, which again it appears to be because so many people have made this claim, then it would serve as a great idea as to how Christianity views men and women when they're not at odds with God. And the word sin literally means to miss the mark. So when people are actually aiming upward and achieving what they want to achieve and not missing the mark with their goals and aspirations and behavior, then there is no moral difference between male and female. No one is subject to either here. And Eve was created to help Adam with his job, right? Adam's job was to name and classify all the plants and animals on the planet, and Eve was brought along to help him with this task. And, Jordan Peterson's idea about this is that this is supposed to represent how men and women interact with each other and with a family on a regular basis. Men are here to keep the house in order. Theoretically, I'm not fucking talking shit about anybody, but men are here to keep the house in order, keep the house alive, all of this stuff, while women are here to bring attention to the things that they are missing the mark on, right? Like maybe they're not taking good enough care of their children while they're working on these external things like getting the house paid for and getting the house taken care of. So she brings that to his attention so he can turn and start working on that as well. And Jordan's idea is that that's what this is supposed to be representing. So Adam may not be classifying or naming all of the animals. Perhaps he's missing a couple that Eve has to bring his attention to help him do his job more effectively. Now that is an example of, I haven't heard too many people make that claim. And Jordan is kind of well known for over-reading a lot of things and over-speaking about a lot. I like Jordan. I don't have anything against him. I look up to him. I've read his books. He seems to be a perfectly good guy. But he does talk a lot, and he may overanalyze a lot of things, and this may be one of them. But I still find it interesting that connection could be made at all, so that's why I brought it up. And then afterwards, everyone knows how this story goes. The serpent tricks, I don't like that word in this situation, but that's how it's often depicted, tricks Eve into eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil tree, and then she tricks Adam into eating the same fruit. God banishes them from the Garden of Eden and puts two cherubims with flaming swords at the entrance so they can never get back in. And when God asked Adam what happened, he said, Eve made me do this, and then Eve says, oh, the snake made me do this. And then God hits them with this terrible set of damnations that I'm about to read here. I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. for dust you are, and to dust you will return. So there are a few things that should be talked about with this specific part of the story called the fall. And the first is that, if we rewind a little bit, God told Adam and Eve that you cannot eat from this tree, and if you do, you will certainly die. And that isn't what happened. So, so much for this all-knowing God, right? He said you were going to eat this fruit and you would certainly die, and they didn't die. If anything, the opposite happened. I think what this story is trying to convey here is that whenever humans developed self-consciousness, this thing that we all use, the thing I'm using to make this podcast right now, the thing you use to problem solve, this consciousness that is extremely unique to humans, as soon as we developed that in our evolutionary process, then we were damned to a life of sacrifice and having to plan for the future and having to work really hard to grow our food, which isn't like exactly what God is talking about. If we try to take care of our family, we can't just be eating the seeds when we're hungry. We have to plant those seeds and take care of them so they can grow and we can all feed each other. Knowing that we exist, knowing our mortality, puts a very specific stress on humans that is not present in any other animal in the animal kingdom. And I think that's very clearly what this story is trying to represent. It's trying to give a religious explanation for the development of self-consciousness. And I think as soon as one consider the name of the tree, the knowledge of good and evil, a zebra or a tiger or a monkey can't tell you what good and evil is, but humans don't really have a problem doing that at all. We can identify things that we have done that are good and things that we have done that are bad. And the reason we can do that is the fact that we developed self-consciousness. Okay, but let's go back even a little bit further and just analyze the entire story of the fall, or not the entire thing, but a lot of it just word by word, line by line. First, the serpent is introduced like this. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" The first sentence is incredibly interesting to me. The serpent was more crafty than any of the animals God had made. To me, that sounds like God didn't make the serpent, right? Why wouldn't it say than any of the other animals God made? Like, group him in with what God had made. Instead, it's saying it's smarter than any of the animals God made. So that's just a really interesting choice of words to me, and that is the choice of words in every single translation. At least all 9 or 10 that I looked at while writing this episode. I'm sure there's 5 billion translations, and one of them may word it a little differently. But the fact that is the common translation is just, it piques my brain a little bit. Other people have talked about this. This isn't my idea originally, but it's a very solid observation. The choice of words, to me, it just screams that God did not make the serpent, and that he is smarter than all of the animals that God did make. And to go a bit deeper, the word used to describe the serpent in Hebrew, the original language of the Bible, I obviously don't speak Hebrew, so I don't know how to pronounce it, but with English translation, it's spelled A-R-U-M, so arum, or something like that, right? And that word is used a couple times throughout the Bible, and in Proverbs 12:16, it uses that word, but it doesn't mean crafty, it means prudent, like intelligent and smart. And if we build off this idea that God did not create the serpent, which I think is precisely what the verse tries to tell us, and we use the different translation for the word arum instead of crafty or cunning, and we think it means prudent, that we leave with a much different description and idea of what is going on here. The serpent was more prudent than any of the animals God made. And if God did make the serpent and he knew of this sort of cunning prudence, why would he put it in the walled garden? The garden is supposed to be a perfect place. They are protected from everything. Why is the snake in here to begin with if God made the snake and the garden? So this prudent being that may not have been created by God then tells Eve, "You will not surely die if you eat this fruit. You will just gain the knowledge of good and evil like God, and he doesn't want that because you will be like him." So Eve ate the fruit, and she didn't die, and she developed the knowledge of good and evil. And it's always been kind of strange how there's a lot of emphasis on the story of Adam and Eve, but no one really talks about the fact that the serpent was 100% correct, and that we did develop the knowledge of good and evil, And we did develop self-consciousness, and we may not have become like God in the classic sense, but we became close enough for him to banish us from his home and guard it with flaming swords. So something clearly happened here, the development of self-consciousness, which, is what I talked about earlier, but just in the mythological sense, like, why is this serpent being correct just overlooked all the time? Like, when I grew up in Lutheran and Catholic school, there was never an acknowledgement of that. It was always that the serpent misled us and gave us this damnation or this damned lifestyle where we have to sacrifice and work to be happy and things of that nature due to self-consciousness. But God said we were going to die, and we did not die. Adam and Eve were just fine. They didn't die in any sense at all. Again, if anything, they woke up. They developed self-consciousness and could look at the world with a different lens, aware of their mortality, aware of their morality, and aware of their nakedness. That's not dying. It's the opposite of dying. And before I go any further, I want to talk about a really, it was popular and it was considered heretical form of Christianity, and that's called Gnosticism. So the basic, most fundamental idea of Gnosticism is that the God that created Earth and the Garden of Eden that is described in the first few chapters of Genesis is like a low-level, egotistical, demiurgic God that just created humans to have worship slaves, basically. And that the serpent was actually the quote-unquote good guy in this story. And some Gnostics associated the serpent with Jesus, because if you play this out, the serpent's activity is the only reason Jesus ever came, because he had to absorb all of our sins and, forgive all of us in his crucifixion. And so without that original activity from the serpent, none of that ever happens. So it's a really interesting thing, and it may sound ridiculous until you consider just a few extra things. One, the serpent is never compared to Satan or the Antichrist or the devil once in the Old Testament. That only happens in the book of Revelations, which is a very recent book in terms of when these biblical stories were written. In fact, the only person in the canonical Bible that is compared to the serpent or compares himself to the serpent is Jesus Christ. And he does this in John chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. He compares his crucifixion to the serpent being lifted up by Moses on the staff. That is a very specific comparison. Right? And as I mentioned earlier, the Gospel of John is probably the most profound, well-written theologic document possibly ever written, ever. But particularly that is true of just comparing the biblical stories. So it's not a surprise that this very strange, philosophical, important comparison is made in that specific book of the Bible. And the exact quote from Jesus is, "Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." So again, this is a really strange comparison, particularly when you take this idea that the serpent is some representation of the devil, right? And this sort of Gnostic approach, I don't want to necessarily say it makes more sense, but it seems perfectly reasonable to come to that conclusion. Right, because we ate this fruit, God banished us from the garden and put flaming swords in front of it and damned us to a life of sacrifice and suffering and death. That seems like an overreaction, right? And that's kind of a constant thing throughout the book of Genesis and the Old Testament in general. And one of the other Gnostic ideas is that the God of the Old Testament and the God after Jesus are not the same thing. It's not representing the same thing at all. And if you look at the difference in outcome and consequence and severity of punishment, then that's a pretty, again, reasonable thing to say. Now, Gnosticism was extremely popular. Valentinus, I believe his name was, almost became the Pope of Rome, and he was a Gnostic. Now, it was completely rooted out by 1500, but it was still very popular at the beginning, the first few centuries after Christ was murdered or crucified. It's very interesting that this heretical idea, apparently heretical idea, was so popular that it almost became the dominant religion in a sense. If Valentinus would have won the seat of Pope, then that would have been reasonable to consider Gnosticism the dominant sect of Christianity at one point. Granted, that didn't happen, but it's more so just this idea that I'm talking about was not just some Mormonism type thing. It wasn't like that at all. It was extremely popular, so much so that a famous priest had to say, if you want to come to a Christian church, ask for the Catholic Church, not the Christian Church, because you may end up in a Gnostic temple. This was an extremely popular idea, and I think the more you read into their texts, it becomes more and more clear why. One of the main things about Gnosticism is that this material world is essentially like hell, and you have to get through this material world that was created by this demiurge to get into the kingdom of heaven. And you can achieve that in this material world, which is exactly what they think Jesus did with his resurrection. It wasn't a physical resurrection, but of like a metaphysical resurrection or a spiritual resurrection whenever he welcomed the idea of this true God, right? So it's a very interesting religion, and it shouldn't be just thrown out the window, because I think there's a lot of sort of wisdom in the Gnostic texts. And, they have the Gospel of Judas, and their idea of Judas was that he was the only disciple Jesus trusted enough to do the necessary evil that would lead to him being crucified. There was the Gospel of Thomas, which, like I said, was just a bunch of different sayings from Jesus, and it was considered secret knowledge from Jesus. So that's an interesting premise as well. So back to Adam and Eve before I move to the next story. To me, it's pretty clear that this was just representing the development of self-consciousness in humans, and it was just a Christian context to that happening. And it explained why, after we develop this self-consciousness and that we're aware of our death, that we have to work and sacrifice for the future. We can't just live moment to moment like wild animals do. We actually have to plan things out so we're not miserable in 2 or 3 years. And this is just explaining that, the reason it's like that is because we fucked up in the beginning and God punished us, right? So it's a great story for the development of self-consciousness. It's just a good theologic myth. It's a good story. The next story I'm going to talk about is, to me, a top 5 biblical story throughout the entire Bible, and it is the story of Cain and Abel. One thing that people who may not have read this story and just have heard of it may not understand is that it's very short. This is the entire story on the screen right here. You can read it literally in 5 minutes. But it is packed with so much information that unpacking it requires a lot more time than it did to read it. And I think Jordan Peterson gives a great explanation as to why that is. This was probably a oral myth that was passed down for many generations. And you can't remember super long stories and keep everything perfect. These people would shorten the story in a way that would keep the meaning around, but would just make it easier to remember. So by the time this was written down in the book of Genesis, it had evolved into its shortest but most meaningful and impactful version possible, right? As much meaning as possible is packed into every single word of this story, because it was probably around for a long time before it was written down, and it had time to evolve into what it is now. So again, here's the story, and it's pretty obvious what's going on in the beginning, and most people, again, are aware of it because it's a very famous and popular story. God is perfectly happy with Abel's sacrifices. He rewards him with good standing with him. He appreciates Abel's sacrifices, but does not appreciate Cain's. And when God notices this, he asks him a question that really has a lot of meaning. And to defend Cain a little bit here, there's every reason to be downcast in this situation. An all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God that exists is not necessarily turning his back against you, but is shaming you for not doing well. I don't think there's any other possible feeling to feel besides being downcast. That's the worst thing a human could experience, is if the universe or God is literally just shaming them, telling them, no, you're doing this wrong, right? So he has every reason to feel downcast. But whenever God talks to him, we learn why God is not accepting him the way he's accepting Cain, and that totally changes the meaning of this story. God basically says, well, if you were doing your job, wouldn't you be welcomed by me? Wouldn't you be appreciated the way Abel is? And so it's indicating that Cain is just not doing enough. He's not giving all of his effort. Abel is providing his firstborn calves, the fat ones, and the firstborn has it's very significant throughout the whole Bible, and I haven't really been able to figure out why that is. But there's kind of a meme in modern life where a woman has a first baby and it's prepared for meticulously, and every step it takes is watched, but then the second baby, they just fucking wing it, and they get it done, obviously, but it's just not nearly as like planned out and practiced as the first baby was. And I think that that may be what this firstborn significance and harping on the Bible may be trying to represent in a way. Again, I'm no philosopher, but that is kind of what sticks out to me with a lot of these stories focusing on the firstborn. God is saying that the only reason I'm not accepting you or giving you good standing like I am Abel is just because you're not working hard enough and you're not sacrificing your best. Which may seem like a selfish, crazy thing to do. It's like, give me your best shit. But I don't think that's really what's happening. I think it's referring to people who don't give 100% of their effort towards things, but expect the reward as if they had done so. And this isn't criticizing anyone. Every single human being who has ever lived has gone through that at one point. You know, they expected to get a better result on a test, even though deep down they know they didn't really put in all that much effort. You know, that's something that happens over and over and over again all throughout your life and everyone else's life. But some people can fall into a trap where that is their entire life. They don't devote 100% of their effort to anything, ever. And I think that's what this is referring to. It's not saying God wants the best you have to offer in terms of your food and sacrifices. It's just saying that, hey, the universe will reward you if you actually put in 100% work. And this, you know, there's an idea that God throughout the entire Bible is just a philosophical representation of self-consciousness, which kind of lines up with the Adam and Eve story. And if you apply that notion, then it still works, right? Like, your consciousness is going to reward you. Like, you'll reward yourself if you know you're putting in all your effort, even if you still fall short, because you can sit back and say, I fucking tried as hard as I could, it just didn't work. And that feels a lot better than failing and sitting there going, damn, I really only put in like 20% effort to this, and I probably could have succeeded if I just would have tried. You know, I think, again, that's what this part of the story is representing. But the next thing God says to Cain is much darker. He basically says that if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door, it desires to have you, but you must rule over it. That's a dark idea, right? That sin is after us, that it's like a predator, that if we make the wrong decision, it can eat us, devour us, and conquer us entirely, but it is our job to fight it off. And I think the meaning behind that is pretty clear, right? We all have evil, like genuine evil within us, but it's something that we have to literally, physically, and mentally fight off. Like, we don't need to look any further than places like Nazi Germany or the USSR. It took people like you and me, with our brains, with our bodies, with our DNA, basically, you know, we have way more in common with those people than we have different. And it took those normal people and led to them throwing infants up in the air and letting them fall to their death in front of their mother. It led to them snitching on their neighbor for taking a piece of grain when they were starving to death and putting them in the gulag. These were normal people, and they let the sin devour them. They did not master it, right? They allowed the worst part of their being to come out, and they celebrated it when it did. Particularly, you know, well, actually, it was particularly true in both the USSR and Nazi Germany. You know, the Germans who were killing the Jews, maybe there was something inside of them that felt bad about it, but that was a celebrated activity back then. It was something that, it was almost like a rite of passage among the Nazi camp guards. They were killing people, they were torturing people, they were doing insane experiments on people. And this is all because they had a system and a society that allowed the worst part of themselves to come out and not be punished. They didn't have to rule over the sin because there was nothing actually keeping them from engaging with it. And in the USSR, it was not uncommon for kids to snitch on their parents. There's actually a famous story of like a 10-year-old boy who snitched on his father for stealing grain when they were pretty much starving to death. And whenever the father found out about this, he killed the little boy. And they built statues of that little boy all over the country, sending the message of, if something wrong is happening, it's your job to snitch, even if it involves you dying for snitching, right? This was something that was promoted because of this evil that lives in every human being. And you can take it back a few steps. Everyone has been in a situation where they just wanted to punch someone so hard that they broke their hand on their jaw. Everyone's felt that. Everyone's felt the need to cuss someone out, slap someone, assault someone, whatever it may be. And you have to fight those feelings off in those moments. And most people do, right? Like, everyone's not out here punching people in the face, unless you're a 2-year-old, which is pretty interesting. You know, there's this idea in the Catholic religion that people are born good. And I don't think that's true. The most violent age group of all humans is from like 2 to 5. Like, you can't get a group of 2 and 5-year-olds together without someone getting bit, someone getting punched, someone getting kicked. They just don't have the ability to end anyone's lives. If they did, a bunch of 2-year-olds would be dying at the hand of other 2-year-olds, because we're extremely just violent animals to start. And when we grow up, we have to push those feelings and emotions and impulses away. We have to conquer the sin, as God described it. And I think there's another aspect to this too, and it's these people who feel like God has turned their back on them. You know, these people who probably haven't been giving 100% effort and not getting rewards. They feel like the universe has disowned them, etc., etc. And they sort of rebel against God and let the sin come in intentionally. And I think those people are like school shooters and mass murderers. You know, like if you read the Columbine journals, those are some fucking dark journals from some high school kids, right? Saying things like there's no other purpose for a human but to kill other humans, and that all humans should be dead, right? Like, this is a rebellion against life itself. And I think that is what this story is also referring to, right? It's letting us know that we have this ability within us if we allow it to come out. And that's exactly what Cain does. Instead of assuming perhaps he's the reason he's not doing well, he assumes it's God, and he rebels against God or the universe or whatever word you want to use, and then he tricks his brother to come out in the field and bashes his skull in with a rock. Cain returns to wherever God can see him. God asks where Abel is, and Cain's response is, "How am I to know? Am I my brother's keeper?" Which I think is a super interesting sentence, and I think it's there intentionally. You know, there's no accidental sentences in literature, right? They're all written intentionally with meaning. And that is such a weird response, because sure, you're not supposed to know your brother's whereabouts at all times, and he's supposed to have some sort of personal responsibility. You can't take care of him your entire life, but particularly with older brothers, which Cain is, there is a sense of keeping care of your brother that has to be there, right? Like, it may not be as strong as a father and a son, but there is certainly something there where you're supposed to take care of your brother and help him. Maybe not keep him in that way, but help him out. Definitely don't murder him. I can guarantee you that's not supposed to be in the playbook. But it's very interesting how immediately upon talking to God, he again rejects this personal responsibility of taking care of his brother. Just like he rejected the responsibility of providing good sacrifice and putting in full work. Right? This is just a story of someone who religiously rejects responsibility and accountability for his actions, and that's even put in more with the next couple lines. Right, he immediately falls into this sort of victimhood where he's crying in fear that someone else is going to murder him now that they know his name. And God assures him that that is not true and says if anyone does murder you, they'll be punished 7 times over. This one's kind of weird to figure out, because throughout the rest of the Old Testament, God will smite people and kill them. But in the situation of killing Cain, he seems to be against it. Like, he doesn't want to kill Cain. He doesn't want Cain to die. And you know, I think there's like 3 interpretations here, and one of them it's like my own that I don't know if I've heard anyone else claim, and that is that I think God is sort of pushing against the self-centeredness required to project your issues onto everyone else. Just because you murdered someone, Cain, doesn't mean that everyone wants to murder somebody. It's very self-centered attitude to say and do those things and look at the world in that way. And I think this is God's attempt at saying, hey, get over yourself. You murdered someone. You're going to be punished for it mentally, but that doesn't mean everyone else is going to stoop to your level. And then the other idea that I've heard is that God didn't want Cain to get out that easily. Sort of this anti-death penalty argument where if someone messes up that badly, you don't let them get out of it so easily as death. You let them torture themselves for the rest of their lives. And then the other is that perhaps God is sending the first message of even murderers, even like fratricidal murders, should have the ability to return to God and shouldn't be killed immediately. Again, I think that idea is kind of weird considering the rest of the stories in the Old Testament and how much that attitude is not held. But I think that'll do it. Wanted to just go over those first 2 stories that I found interesting as I read them, and I'm going to do some more reading tonight, and hopefully this will be a regular podcast series where I just go over the Bible and sort of interpret the stories, right? They're very interesting stories. There's a reason they've been around for so long. And I think as soon as you start analyzing them in this way, you see that there's so much meaning you can extract from them. If you were to read the Cain and Abel story and go over it as we just did, you can come up with all sorts of guidelines for your life. Like, maybe I should put in 100% effort if I actually want to achieve something. Or at the very least, if I don't decide to put in 100% effort towards this thing, I can't be upset when it doesn't work out. And I actually think that that's a big one. A lot of this episode has talked about things like drug science, and I can't tell you how many times I've had a conversation with someone who will willingly admit that they have not put any work into understanding the subject, but will sit here and argue with people like me who have studied it for years about the science of the topic. Not even just the policy, but people will tell you what they think a drug does, and even if you can explain that that's just not what it does, they will still die on that hill. And that's just another, like, you did not put work in. Why are you acting like you're in a position to talk about it authoritatively? And so I think you can extract these sort of metaphors and meanings from all of these stories. That's why they're so popular. So I'm going to go through, and even as an atheist, I find meaning in these stories that are helpful. I'm just an atheist in the sense that there is not any evidence that a being created this earth, or that a being resurrected someone from the death, from the cross, or that a being made a virgin give birth to the Savior. I don't believe in the literal truth of any of that. But I do believe in this sort of meta-truth. This Cain and Abel story happens all the time, as I've pointed out already. It's like a Dostoevsky novel. These events didn't actually happen, but there is some sort of meaning and sense of truth within them. And I think that is where Christianity should focus most of its attention, instead of, like the last episode, pushing it into the realm of science. So, again, this will be a regular podcast series, and I'm going to read some more and get another episode written, and hopefully next week we'll do another one in this series. So thank you guys very much. Y'all take it easy.